November 12th, 1942. The western desert stretched out in all directions like a sea made of silence. The air shimmered above the sand, bending light until the horizon itself seemed to waver between earth and sky. Nothing moved except the wind, dry, restless, eternal, carrying the scent of oil, dust, and the faint iron tang of burnt metal. Along a narrow ridge where the British Eighth Army had made its stand only a few hours before, a column of German reconnaissance vehicles rolled to a stop. The engines idled for a moment, coughing out clouds of gray exhaust before fading into the stillness. What remained of the battlefield looked less like a victory and more like exhaustion carved into the earth. Twisted trucks, shell holes, and the occasional ragged boot half buried in sand. Among the debris, one shape stood out. Not a German machine. Not even British. It sat half hidden behind a shattered fuel drum, its olive drab paint dulled by dust, its tires still inflated, its canvas top folded down. A strange little vehicle, boxy, compact, and oddly purposeful. The markings on its side were American. The stenciled letters, barely visible beneath the grime, read, Willys MB. The German reconnaissance officer in charge, Oberleutnant Friedrich Adler, narrowed his eyes against the glare. Amerikanisch, he muttered, stepping down from his Kubelwagen. His boots sank into the sand with a crunch. He adjusted his cap, studied the vehicle, then glanced toward the men behind him. Bring the mechanics. I want this inspected. The order rippled through the small group. 3 men broke off from the convoy. Dust-covered, sweat-soaked, their uniforms the faded gray of desert fatigue. They were mechanics, veterans of the Africa Corps motor pool, the kind of soldiers who could rebuild an engine with their eyes closed. One of them, a stocky, middle-aged man with oil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, squinted through the sunlight. His name was Ernst Keller. Keller had spent 20 years building, fixing, and revering machines. In Germany, he'd worked in a precision factory outside Stuttgart, where tolerances were sacred and every screw had its place. To him, machinery was not just function. It was craftsmanship, discipline, pride. The idea that anything worth building could be simple was almost an insult. Now, standing before the captured American vehicle, he felt a flicker of disdain. This, he said, his voice low and skeptical. This is what they send to war? It looks like a child's toy. Adler gave a faint smirk. Perhaps the Americans think war is a game. The men chuckled. But even as they did, Keller moved closer. Something about the little machine didn't fit the joke. Its shape was blunt but purposeful. The front grille, slotted steel, upright and narrow, seemed designed for efficiency, not show. The tires were thick, the fenders rounded like the shoulders of a working animal. Keller ran his hand along the hood, feeling the sand scrape beneath his palm. The metal was hot, the kind of heat that burned slowly, not sharply. He crouched, studying the suspension, the axles, the wheelbase. Everything about it seemed deliberate, but not delicate. Open it, Adler ordered. The soldiers hesitated. The hood latch was oddly shaped, nothing like a German clasp. Keller reached forward, found the mechanism, and flipped it open with a single motion. The hood lifted easily. Too easily, he thought. It didn't resist like the heavy steel covers of German trucks. It was light, balanced, almost inviting. Underneath, the engine waited. Compact, neatly arranged, and clean. Not polished, just clear. Each wire was color-coded, each component labeled in English letters. Fuel lines ran in straight paths, uncluttered by unnecessary fittings. The carburetor was small, the air filter simple, the battery easily accessible. Keller blinked. The arrangement wasn't beautiful, but it was smart. He leaned closer. Go, Devil, he read aloud from the small tag riveted to the block. Go Devil engine, 4-cylinder, 134 cubic inches. He trailed off, realizing he was translating automatically. The others watched him, waiting for ridicule, but he didn't speak again. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a rag, and began wiping a bit of grime off a spark plug cap. The more he looked, the less he understood. Not because it was crude, but because it wasn't. There was a logic here, a kind of clarity that German design rarely allowed. Not much to it, one soldier said. Wouldn't last a month in this heat. Keller didn't answer. He tightened a cap, pressed a hose, checked a bolt with his fingers. Every piece felt uniform, standard. No special machining, no unique fittings. Any soldier could fix this with a basic wrench set. He looked up at Adler, then back at the Jeep. It's not made to impress, Keller said finally. It's made to work. Adler frowned. Explain. Keller hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sir, our vehicles, they are precise, too precise. If one part fails, we need another of the same. If sand enters the carburetor, the engine stalls. This is built to survive it. The lieutenant's expression hardened. Half interest, half irritation. Are you saying their engineering is superior? Keller looked at the Jeep again, then shook his head slowly. Not superior. Different. It's forgiving. Forgiving. The word felt strange in his mouth. In the Reich, machines were instruments of control, demanding obedience, punishing failure. This one felt like a partner. He climbed into the driver's seat. The canvas smelled of oil and sunlight. The controls were simple. 3 pedals, a shifter, a few levers. He turned the key, pressed the starter, and the engine coughed to life on the first try. The sound wasn't refined. It rattled. But it ran. Steady, rhythmic, alive. Keller's lips parted slightly. Hörstades? He said quietly. Do you hear that? The others nodded, listening to the steady idle. It wasn't the roar of German horsepower. It was something else. A heartbeat. He let it run, revved it once, twice. The Jeep responded instantly, eager. Then he shut it down, sitting in silence as the engine clicked and cooled in the desert air. The only sound left was the whisper of wind and the faint metallic tick-tick-tick of contracting steel. Take it back to camp, Adler ordered finally. We'll test it properly. As the Jeep was towed away, Keller walked beside it, eyes never leaving the machine. Somewhere inside, beneath the dust and sweat, a question began to form. One he didn't want to ask but couldn't silence. What if we have been building the wrong way all along? That night, the desert turned cold. The stars were sharp and countless, scattered like shards of glass across the black sky. The German camp glowed faintly with lanterns. Mechanics worked on damaged half-tracks, officers studied maps, and in the center of it all, the American Jeep sat under a tarp, its silhouette small but unmistakable. Keller couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he slipped out of his tent and walked toward it. He lifted the tarp. There it was again, that plain, utilitarian face. He ran his fingers along the front grille, tracing the stamped steel, the slotted openings. He thought of Stuttgart, of assembly lines filled with men bending over machines that demanded perfection. He thought of his son, 12 years old, building model airplanes from scraps of aluminum, dreaming of the Luftwaffe. And he thought of this, a vehicle built by a nation that, until recently, many in Germany had dismissed as industrial amateurs. Yet here it was, a symbol of something else entirely. The next morning, as the sun clawed its way over the horizon, Keller and 2 mechanics began their inspection in full daylight. They removed panels, unscrewed bolts, measured tolerances. The results were undeniable. This thing was built to be repaired, not revered. A broken part could be swapped in minutes. Even the toolkit inside came with clear, simple diagrams printed on laminated cards. No need for training schools, no need for specialized machinery. Adler arrived mid-morning, watching them work. "Well?" he asked. Keller wiped his forehead, glanced at the Jeep, then back at his commanding officer. "It's remarkable." The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "That's not the word I expected." "It's the truth," Keller said quietly. "They've built something we can't outmatch with pride or precision. We build for engineers. They build for soldiers." Adler's expression hardened. "Be careful what you admire, Keller." Keller nodded, but the seed had already taken root. For the rest of that day, as he dismantled and reassembled parts, his hands moved on their own. But his mind wandered. He thought about what this machine represented. Not genius, not craftsmanship, but a kind of democratic intelligence. A belief that good design should serve everyone, even a man in the mud, far from home. By nightfall, the Jeep had become something of a curiosity in the camp. Officers stopped by to look at it. Soldiers laughed about its size, compared it to toy wagons. But Keller noticed something else. They lingered longer than they expected. They touched it, studied it, asked questions. Even the most arrogant among them seemed quietly intrigued. Later, after dinner, Keller sat alone by the vehicle, staring at it under the flickering light of a lantern. The desert was silent again, just as it had been when they found it. Only now the silence felt different, not emptiness, but thought. He opened his notebook, one he'd carried since the start of the campaign, and began to write. Greater than captured vehicle, marked Willys MB. Observations. Extraordinary simplicity. All components appear standardized, interchangeable. Wiring, color-coded. Bolts, uniform. Engine, compact and efficient. Design philosophy unknown to me. Function prioritizes field service over perfection. Possible reason for American industrial confidence. He paused, then added a final line. One he would never show his superiors. Greater than this may be the future. When the desert wind rose again, it carried grains of sand across the Jeep's hood, whispering like ghosts through its grill. The same wind that had buried empires now brushed across something new. Something born not of pride, but of practicality. And as the lantern flickered out, leaving the Jeep bathed in starlight, Keller realized that this captured machine, silent, simple, stubborn, might outlast everything they believed about German superiority. It wasn't beauty that would win wars. It was clarity. And in that moment, under the endless desert sky, one German mechanic began to understand that clarity could be the deadliest weapon of all. The desert had its own kind of silence. It wasn't peaceful, not really. It was the silence that came after things stopped moving. After engines died, after shouting ended, after victory or defeat had both burned themselves out. The silence that forced men to listen to their own thoughts. For 3 days, that silence wrapped around the German camp as the mechanics worked on the captured Willys MB. The Jeep sat in the middle of the yard, its faded olive body contrasting sharply against the pale sand. Around it, the soldiers moved like bees around something they didn't quite understand, drawn by curiosity, not command. Every morning began the same way. The sun would rise hard and fast, baking the sand before the first hour had passed. The metal of the Jeep was already hot by the time Keller reached it, carrying his tools and his doubts. His men, Vogel, young and restless. Meinhardt, older and perpetually irritated, waited for orders. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt the same quiet unease. There was something about this vehicle that refused to fit neatly into their world of bolts and blueprints. "Begin again," Keller said. They started by dismantling the front grille. Each bolt came loose without protest. No seizing, no specialized head, no trick of German ingenuity required. Then the radiator, then the fan belt, carburetor, distributor cap. Every piece they removed revealed another that could be understood without manuals or diagrams. It was mechanical honesty, a machine stripped of ego. Keller wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked down at the engine block. The light from the rising sun bounced off the stamped letters. Willys Overland, Toledo, Ohio. He repeated the words softly as though testing their shape in his mouth. Toledo, Ohio. They sounded unfamiliar, almost humble, not like the proud names of Stuttgart or Munich, the homes of precision. Vogel peered over his shoulder. Simple design, he said, half sneering. It lacks refinement. Keller didn't look up. No, he said quietly. It lacks complication. He traced the lines of the fuel system with his finger. Short, direct, unpretentious. No ornamentation, no polished surfaces, just function. He remembered his old factory back home. The supervisor who scolded him once for filing a part too quickly. A craftsman must love perfection, Keller. He had believed it. But here, in this patch of desert, staring at this engine that ran on logic rather than luxury, he wasn't so sure anymore. When they lifted the hood fully, it balanced effortlessly on its hinges. Vogel noticed it too. Lightweight, he muttered. Keller nodded. Steel pressed thin, but reinforced at key points. Enough strength, not excess. Clever Adler appeared mid-morning, his uniform immaculate despite the dust. Progress? He asked, his tone clipped. Keller straightened. The Americans built with purpose, not pride. Every component serves necessity. Adler frowned. You admire this? I study it, Keller corrected, though his voice betrayed something deeper. There's a difference. The lieutenant walked around the Jeep, inspecting it like an art critic analyzing a crude painting. It's ugly. Perhaps, Keller said, but beauty doesn't always survive a sandstorm. Adler smirked. Ours will. German steel doesn't yield. Keller didn't argue. But later, as he poured a line of fuel into the carburetor to test the engine again, he thought about that sentence. German steel doesn't yield. Neither, he realized, did American practicality. When the engine roared to life again, it startled even him. The sound was raw, unrefined, but steady. He pressed the throttle. The Jeep shuddered once, then settled into a smooth, patient hum. He stood there, listening. The Go Devil engine didn't sing like the sleek Maybachs that powered German Panzers. It didn't boast or threaten. It persisted. And in war, persistence was everything. He motioned for Vogel to climb in. Take it 50 meters and back. Vogel hesitated. Without inspection clearance? Go. The Jeep rolled forward easily, its tires biting into the sand like it had been born there. Vogel shifted gears, turned, and came back grinning. It moves like a beetle on stone, he said, surprised. Keller smiled faintly. That's the idea. By noon, the camp was alive with talk. Men gathered around, pointing, whispering. Some mocked the shape, a box with wheels, but others, quietly, were impressed. Even the officers, hiding their curiosity behind cigarettes and sunglasses, kept stealing glances. That afternoon, Adler summoned Keller to his tent. The canvas walls flapped lazily in the heat. Inside, the air smelled of dust and coffee. I've read your notes, Adler said, holding up the mechanic's small, oil-stained notebook. You write like an engineer, not a soldier. Keller stood straight. Machines are honest, sir. They tell truths men prefer to ignore, Adler smirked. And what truth does this Jeep tell? Keller hesitated, choosing his words carefully. That we build for glory. They build for endurance. We chase perfection. They chase purpose. The lieutenant leaned back in his chair. Purpose doesn't win wars, Keller. Power does. Power fades when it can't be repaired, Keller said quietly. Adler's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. When Keller left the tent, the wind had picked up. Sand swirled across the camp in thin, ghostly ribbons. The Jeep stood by itself, its shape half buried but defiant. He walked toward it, crouched by the wheel, and brushed the sand away with his hand. That night, he couldn't sleep again. The desert was colder than he remembered. A thin, biting chill that crept through the seams of the tent. He sat outside with a lantern, staring at the Jeep parked in the moonlight. Its simplicity haunted him. Every bolt, every joint, every hinge was an argument against the world he came from. He'd been taught that complexity was strength, that mastery meant control. But this was something new. Simplicity as intelligence. He opened his notebook again, sketching by the dim light. Greater than no part unnecessary, no component unique, a machine any man can fix, efficiency born not from genius, but humility. As he wrote, the camp slept. Somewhere in the distance, artillery murmured. A faint reminder that men were still dying over the question of who built the better world. At dawn, Keller assembled his team again. They rolled the Jeep out beyond the camp to a flat stretch of sand and gravel. There, beside their own Kübelwagen, they began the tests. Side by side, German precision and American pragmatism met in the open sun. The Kübelwagen moved first, steady, graceful, until it hit a ridge of loose sand. Its rear wheels spun, spraying dust, the engine whining uselessly. It took 3 men pushing to get it free. Then the Jeep. Keller climbed in himself this time. He pressed the clutch, shifted into low gear, and eased forward. The little vehicle climbed the ridge, rocked once, and rolled over effortlessly. He turned it in a slow circle, feeling the tires grip with a stubborn confidence. The soldiers watching didn't speak. They just stared. Keller stopped beside the stuck Kübelwagen and looked out across the horizon. The sun was blazing white now, the air trembling with heat. He shut off the engine, the silence returning like a judgment. Vogel broke it. "Sir," he said almost sheepishly, "it shouldn't have done that." Keller smiled faintly. And yet, it did. Later that evening, they sat around the campfire. A small circle of men surrounded by endless sand. Flames flickered, shadows shifting across their faces. Someone passed around a canteen, someone else a cigarette. Keller sat quietly, staring into the fire. Finally, he spoke. Not to anyone, but to the night. "This isn't primitive engineering," he said softly. "It's practical genius." Vogel frowned. "Genius? It's simple." "That's why it's genius," Keller replied. "Anyone can make something complicated. But to make it simple, to make it work, that takes something else." The others fell silent. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the dark. In that moment, surrounded by men who had spent their lives worshiping precision, Keller felt something shift. A small, unspoken understanding. That maybe the strength of a nation wasn't in how perfectly it built, but how quickly it could learn, adapt, repair. How it trusted ordinary men to handle extraordinary tools. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew it. The war would be decided not by brilliance, but by production. As he turned in for the night, Keller glanced back one last time at the Jeep, sitting quiet and unassuming in the dark. It didn't look victorious. It looked inevitable. And in the silence of that desert, he began to feel what no German soldier dared admit. Admiration. The desert had a way of grinding pride down to dust. Out here, even metal learned humility. Sand crept into every bearing, every bolt, every valve. It didn't matter how well something was built. Eventually, the desert found its weakness. That was why the tests mattered. For 3 days and nights, The mechanics of the Africa Corps ran the Willys MB through every trial they could imagine. They wanted it to fail, almost needed it to. Pride demanded it. But the Jeep refused to oblige. It ran when it shouldn't have. It started when nothing else did. And when Keller drove it through a ravine thick with soft sand, it crawled out the other side while the German Kübelwagen sank like a wounded animal. The men stopped laughing after that. Each morning began earlier than the one before. The desert light hit hard and white over the horizon, revealing the same half-buried field of wreckage. British trucks, German armor, burnt-out supply lorries. Amid that silent graveyard, the Jeep looked almost out of place. Small, plain, unimpressive. And yet, every man who saw it began to understand it in a new way. Keller's notebook filled with sketches. He studied the drivetrain, the axles, the leaf springs, and found the same strange wisdom in every piece. Nothing over-designed, nothing wasted. The simplicity was not ignorance. It was insight. "Sir," Vogel said one afternoon, kneeling beside the front suspension, "this design, it's crude, but efficient. It uses standard bolts across multiple joints." Keller nodded. "They've eliminated the need for precision tools. Any soldier could replace this in the field." Vogel frowned. "But that means anyone could build it." Exactly. That word hung in the air. In the German mind, mastery meant exclusivity. The idea that only trained craftsmen could produce perfection. The Willys MB spat in the face of that idea. It democratized engineering. It was built for mass hands, not master hands. As the tests continued, Keller's admiration deepened into something close to reverence. He could feel it even in the way the Jeep moved over terrain. Flexible, forgiving, never fighting the ground but flowing over it. It was a machine that trusted its driver to be human. On the third day, Adler arrived again, his boots crunching through the sand. "Report," he said curtly. Keller stood beside the Jeep, wiping his hands with a rag. "Sir, we've driven over 30 kilometers in mixed terrain. Sand, gravel, ridge. No significant failures. Engine runs hot but stable." Adler squinted at him. "And?" Keller hesitated, then spoke plainly. "Our vehicles demand perfection to function. This one functions in imperfection." The lieutenant frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning if a soldier breaks a part, he replaces it. If a line cracks, he cuts it and ties it back. It's built to survive mistakes." Adler looked at the Jeep as though it had personally insulted him. "That's not engineering. That's compromise." Keller met his gaze. "It's victory." Adler's silence lasted too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Be careful, Keller. You speak like a man who admires the enemy." Keller didn't reply. He simply saluted, then turned back to the engine. Because in truth, admiration had already replaced arrogance. And he knew that in war, understanding the enemy was the only way to survive him. That night, as the men gathered around their small fire, the conversation shifted from gossip to questions. "Why don't we build like this?" one asked. "Because we're Germans," another replied, half mocking, half sincere. "We don't build toys." Keller listened, his eyes on the flames. "No," he said softly. "We build monuments." They looked at him. He gestured toward the Jeep, its silhouette faint in the moonlight. This is not a monument. It's a tool. And tools win wars." The younger soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. No one wanted to agree, but no one could argue either. By morning, even the skeptics were curious. They lined up to drive it, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to feel what Keller had felt. One after another, they took the wheel. Some laughed at first. The steering was light, the suspension bouncy. But when the Jeep refused to stall, when it climbed slopes their own vehicles couldn't, the laughter faded into silence. It wasn't pride they felt anymore. It was respect. That afternoon, a British prisoner column passed by the camp under guard. Dusty, tired men in torn uniforms. Among them, a few glanced toward the jeep and smiled faintly, recognition flashing in their eyes. Keller caught one of them looking and gave a small nod. The British soldier returned it. An unspoken acknowledgement between mechanics on opposite sides of the war. Later, when the sun dipped low, painting the desert in red and gold, Keller sat beside the jeep with his hands resting on his knees. He thought about home, about his workshop, the smell of metal and oil, his son's laughter echoing through the narrow streets of Stuttgart. He wondered if his son would ever see what he was seeing now, a world not of rivalry, but of learning. Vogel sat beside him. "What are you thinking?" "That everything we know might be wrong," Keller said quietly. Vogel chuckled nervously. "You're tired." "Maybe," Keller said, "but look around you, Vogel. Every vehicle here, every one of ours, is a masterpiece, and every one of them is broken. This one," he gestured to the jeep, "isn't." Vogel didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, as the wind howled over the dunes, Keller wrote again in his notebook. Greater than. The Americans understand something we forgot. Simplicity multiplies strength. A machine that anyone can build becomes a machine that everyone can use. Genius is not in the detail. It's in the design that forgives. He paused, his pen hovering, then added another line. Greater than, we may win battles, but they will win the war. When he closed the notebook, he stared at the jeep for a long time. Its metal caught the faint starlight, a dull gleam in the darkness. It didn't look heroic, but it felt eternal. A machine born of necessity, destined for endurance. At dawn, he woke to the sound of engines. Not theirs, but Allied aircraft somewhere beyond the horizon. The war was shifting. He could feel it in his bones, even before the orders came to retreat northward. Before they left, Keller walked once more around the jeep. He brushed his hand across the hood, feeling the grit and warmth. Then, almost without thinking, he spoke aloud. "You'll outlive us all." The desert wind swallowed his words. Hours later, as the column moved out, the jeep was left behind. Abandoned again, just as they had found it. But this time, it was no mystery. It was a message. To those who would find it next, the British, the Americans, whoever came, it would say silently what Keller already knew. Perfection dies in the dust. Simplicity survives. And as the German convoy disappeared into the endless horizon, the jeep sat alone, half buried in the sand, the faint imprint of a mechanic's hand still visible on its hood, a mark of understanding left behind in the middle of war. Texas, 1943. The first thing Keller noticed wasn't the barbed wire. It was the smell. Grass, pine, and something sweet in the air. Something he hadn't smelled since before the war. It wasn't fuel or oil or smoke. It was freedom, carried on a breeze that didn't know what it meant to lose. He stood in line with hundreds of other German prisoners, dusty and silent, their uniforms faded to the color of the land. The train that had brought them from New York had rattled for days, its windows streaked with dust, its cargo a mix of soldiers and ghosts. They'd been captured in Tunisia, Africa already lost. Now they were thousands of miles from the war, from Europe, from everything that had once seemed certain. A sign near the gate read, Camp Crossville, U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp. Beneath it, an American guard leaned lazily against a post, chewing gum, rifle slung across his shoulder like a prop. He looked impossibly young, too young to be an enemy. When Keller stepped off the truck, he felt the weight of eyes. Curious, not hostile. The camp wasn't what he expected. No snarling dogs, no whips, just wooden barracks, laundry lines fluttering, and the distant laughter of guards who didn't seem to hate them. They were assigned quarters. 10 men to a room, with bunks made from pine and mattresses filled with straw. There were showers with hot water. Real food. And that night, in the mess hall, Keller tasted something that nearly broke him. Fresh bread. He hadn't realized how much he'd forgotten its warmth. In the following weeks, he adjusted to captivity like a man waking from a fever. The Americans didn't humiliate them. They gave them work. Real work. Some were sent to farms, others to repair shops. Keller, naturally, was sent to the motor pool. That was where he saw them again. Rows upon rows of Willys MB Jeeps parked in neat lines under the Texas sun, each identical to the one he'd studied in the desert. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Engines open, tires stacked, soldiers in khaki uniforms moving between them like bees. For a moment, he just stood there, speechless. In Africa, one captured Jeep had been enough to shake his certainty. Here, he was surrounded by an army of them. A young American sergeant approached, wiping his hands with a rag. "You the new mechanic?" he asked, his accent thick with the South. Keller nodded slowly. Yes, mechanic." "Good," the sergeant said. "Name's Frank. You break it, you fix it." He grinned, motioning to the endless field of Jeeps. "Plenty to learn from, Kraut." Keller smiled faintly. "Plenty to admire, too." Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" Keller hesitated. "In your country, even war machines are honest." Frank laughed. "Honest? That's a new one. Most of us just call them stubborn." They got to work side by side. Two men who should have been enemies, bound instead by bolts and grease. Frank showed him the manuals, printed pages filled with illustrations so clear a child could follow them. Keller flipped through the diagrams, stunned. "This," he said softly, "this is written for soldiers?" "For anyone," Frank said. "We don't expect them to know much. Army figures it's better if the book does the thinking." Keller looked up. "In Germany, a book like this would insult the engineer." Frank shrugged. "In America, it trains him." It was a simple exchange, but for Keller, it struck deeper than any argument. He saw it everywhere. In the workshops, the supply lines, even the cafeteria. Americans built systems, not just machines. They trusted their people to use them, not worship them. By summer, Keller had memorized every part of the Willys MB. He could strip and rebuild one blindfolded. He started teaching other prisoners, young men who'd once sneered at the primitive American toy. Now they came to him quietly, notebooks in hand, hungry to learn. He taught them how to replace brake shoes in under 10 minutes, how to adjust the carburetor by sound, how to swap an engine without a lift, using nothing but a wooden beam and teamwork. Every lesson felt like redemption. One afternoon, Frank watched him teaching a group of prisoners under a shed. "You run a good class," he said, lighting a cigarette. Keller looked up from the engine block. "In another life, I trained apprentices." "Guess you still are," Frank said. "Only now you're on the other side of the fence." Keller smiled. "Maybe fences don't matter when there's an engine between." They both laughed. But behind the laughter was something unspoken. Respect. That night, Keller sat by his bunk, writing again in his notebook. The paper had grown soft from use, the ink smudged by sweat and oil. Greater than, America builds confidence the way it builds machines, simply openly, in repetition. Every soldier here is an engineer in training. The manuals speak in plain language, not arrogance. Their strength is not in genius, but in scale. They build for the many, not the few. He paused, then added, "Greater than we built masterpieces. They build miracles." Weeks turned to months. He saw more than machines. He saw a culture. The Americans fixed engines with country songs on their lips. They argued, joked, swore. But they finished the job. Their garages were loud, messy, alive. Back home, Keller had been taught that order was God. But here, he saw that chaos, managed with faith, could build empires. One day, while repairing a differential, Keller found himself humming an American tune he'd heard on the camp radio. Frank noticed and laughed. "Careful, old man. You're starting to sound like one of us." Keller grinned. "Then maybe you're teaching me well." By 1944, the motor pool became his classroom. New prisoners arrived, some bitter, some broken. He gave them purpose. "Learn," he told them. "Watch how they work. This is the future." And when news came that Germany was losing on every front, Keller felt no triumph, no despair, only clarity. He remembered the first time he'd lifted the hood of a Willys Jeep in the desert and realized that war wasn't about pride. It was about practicality. He thought of something Frank had said months earlier. "You fellas build like you're trying to impress the world. We build like we're trying to save it." Now he understood. That winter, as snow dusted the roofs of the barracks, Keller stood outside, watching the stars. Somewhere across the ocean, his homeland burned. But here, surrounded by machines that ran not on arrogance but on logic, he felt something rare. Hope. He wasn't free yet. But he'd learned what freedom looked like. A nation that trusted its mechanics more than its generals. A factory that built for soldiers, not statues. A people who found strength in simplicity. The war had taken everything from him. But in this quiet, unlikely classroom, a Texas motor pool filled with the hum of engines and the laughter of young Americans, it had given him something back. Knowledge. And he knew, even then, that knowledge would rebuild what pride had destroyed. Germany, 1946. The war was over. But the silence it left behind was louder than the bombs that had ended it. Keller stepped off the transport truck into what had once been Stuttgart, his home, his pride, his past. Now it was rubble. The air carried the stale scent of wet ash and burnt timber. Whole neighborhoods had collapsed into their own basements. A tram line jutted from the ground like a broken rib. He stood there for a long moment, suitcase in hand, staring at what had become of his world. The factory where he'd once worked, where precision had been a religion, was gone. Just a skeletal frame of steel twisted by fire. The sign that had read Deutsche Maschinenbauwerke hung by a single bolt, swaying in the wind. He walked past it, his boots crunching over glass and stone, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. The pride that had fueled him before the war now felt like poison. But he wasn't empty-handed. He carried a small, oil-stained notebook, the same one he'd filled in the desert, and later in captivity. Inside were sketches, notes, lessons learned in a place he never expected to learn them. At the back of the notebook, one line stood out, underlined twice in pencil. Greater than build simple, build strong. Build for the man who needs it, not the man who designed it. He carried that line like a prayer. It took him 3 weeks to find work. Most factories were gone or under Allied control. The Americans, British, and French had divided Germany into zones, each rebuilding on its own terms. But one day, a British officer inspecting local workshops looked at Keller's papers and said, "You were a mechanic? We need one." The job was at an Allied motor depot, repairing American vehicles left over from the war. When Keller arrived, the sight stunned him. There, in neat rows under a corrugated steel roof, stood dozens of Willys Jeeps. The same ones he had first seen in the desert. The same ones he had repaired in Texas. It felt like fate. The officer in charge, a stocky Scotsman named Captain Hargreaves, handed him a wrench and said, "Get them running, Kraut. We're using them to rebuild your country." Keller nodded silently and went to work. He lifted the hood of the first Jeep, and for a moment, the years fell away. the desert sun, the Texas wind, the sound of engines that never quit. It was all there. His hands remembered what his mind didn't need to. He adjusted the choke, cleaned the plugs, rewired the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, and came to life. Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. "Quick work." Keller smiled faintly. "It's an honest machine." Word spread quickly. Within weeks, other German mechanics came to watch him. Some had been soldiers, others factory men. They gathered in the depot after hours, listening as he explained what he'd learned in captivity. The American philosophy of simplicity. He drew diagrams on scraps of cardboard. "This," he said, sketching the Jeep's drivetrain, "isn't just a vehicle. It's a lesson. Every part fits everywhere. Every bolt is standard. You don't need precision to build strength. You need understanding." One young man raised his hand. "But sir, our way, the German way, is excellence." Keller nodded. "And excellence failed us. We built things that only experts could fix. The Americans built things anyone could use." The young man frowned. "But they won because they had more." "No," Keller said quietly. "They had enough. That's all they ever needed." Over the next year, Keller became a teacher again. Unofficial, unpaid, but essential. He trained dozens of young men to maintain the Allied vehicles that now hauled bricks, food, medicine. Every Jeep that rolled out of his workshop carried a piece of the new Germany. Practical, humble, and determined to survive. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, Keller would walk home through the ruins. He'd see children playing in the shells of bombed buildings, pretending the Jeep engines echoing through the valley were thunder or music. He'd see women planting small gardens in the craters left by bombs. And he'd see something he hadn't seen since before the war. Hope. It came slowly, like grass through cracks. By 1947, Keller's workshop had become a hub for young engineers. Allied officers encouraged it. They brought him manuals, spare parts, and once, an entire Willys MB that had been wrecked in a river crossing. Keller and his students stripped it down, rebuilt it from scratch, and painted it gray, the color of ash and rebirth. When it finally ran again, Keller stood beside it, hands trembling. He touched the hood and whispered, "You carried soldiers through war. Now you'll carry workers through peace." The Jeep rumbled away down the street, leaving behind a trail of dust. The same dust that had once meant death, now turned into life. That night, Keller wrote one final entry in his notebook. Greater than, "We lost the war, but we gained wisdom. We learned that strength is not in control, but in understanding. That machines should serve people, not pride. The Americans taught us this, not with words, but with engines." He closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer beside his bed. For the first time in years, he slept without dreams. When spring came, new factories opened across West Germany. They didn't build weapons anymore. They built tractors, trucks, and eventually, cars. Small ones at first, cheap and reliable. Vehicles for people who had nothing left but a will to move forward. Keller visited one of those new factories in 1948. The foreman, a young man in his 20s, greeted him like an old mentor. "Herr Keller," he said proudly, "we're using your methods. Standard bolts, interchangeable parts, simplified assemblies." Keller smiled. "Then you're not using my methods. You're using the right ones." He walked through the plant, watching rows of workers assembling vehicles that weren't elegant but efficient. For every car that rolled off the line, he saw another brick laid in the foundation of a new world. At the far end of the factory floor, a small sign hung above the entrance. "Build simple. Build strong. Build for everyone." Keller stopped, staring at it for a long time. He didn't write it, but he didn't need to. The idea had already taken root. That evening, as he walked home past the sound of hammers and engines, he saw a group of children playing beside the road. One of them was pushing a wooden toy car made from scrap, square, rough, but rolling smoothly across the cobblestones. He smiled. "That's how it starts," he said softly. The boy looked up, puzzled. "What starts?" "The future." Bonn, 1972. The museum smelled faintly of oil, dust, and memory. The kind of smell that belonged not to the past, but to the things that had survived it. Rows of artifacts lined the hall. Rusted helmets, faded flags, bent rifles. Glass cases held uniforms that no longer fit any living man. But near the far end, under a soft pool of light, stood something that didn't need translation or nostalgia. A Willys MB Jeep, restored to perfection. The paint was fresh, but the spirit was the same. Olive drab with white stencil lettering, its tires black and new, its seats worn just enough to feel real. The small placard in front of it read, U.S. Army, Model 1942, captured in North Africa. Keller stood before it, cane in hand, his reflection faint in the glass. His hair had turned the color of snow, his back slightly bent, but his eyes, sharp, steady, unclouded, were the same eyes that had stared into that engine 30 years ago in the desert. Around him, a small group of men gathered. Old veterans of the Africa Corps. Their uniforms long gone, replaced by pressed suits and trembling hands. They greeted one another quietly, their voices carrying the weight of age and time. "Can you believe it?" one of them murmured. "After all these years, it's still here." Another chuckled. "I remember when we thought this little thing was a joke." Keller smiled faintly. So did I. The laughter faded into silence as they all looked at the Jeep. For a long moment, no one spoke. It wasn't an object anymore. It was a witness to everything they'd been and everything they'd become. A museum curator approached. A young woman, maybe 30, with a clipboard and kind eyes. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "we didn't expect such a turnout. Would any of you care to share a few words for the record?" The men glanced at one another. Keller said nothing. He didn't like speeches, but when the others stepped back, all eyes turned to him. He nodded slowly. "I will." He moved closer to the Jeep, resting his hand on the cool metal of the hood. The texture felt the same. Honest, unpretentious. He took a breath, then spoke in a voice roughened by years but still steady. "I first saw this vehicle in 1942, he began. "The desert was hot enough to melt the soul out of a man. We had captured it from the Americans, thought it was nothing, a toy. We laughed at it. We believed that complexity was strength." He paused, eyes distant. "But we were wrong." The curator listened, her pen still. The other veterans stood in silence. "This Jeep," Keller continued, "taught me more about engineering, and about people, than any factory or classroom ever did. It was built not for pride, but for purpose. Not to impress, but to endure. It forgave mistakes. It worked when it shouldn't have. And when everything else broke down, this one kept moving." He looked up, meeting the curator's gaze. "We thought victory belonged to the nation with the most genius, but it belonged to the nation with the most humility." For a moment, the only sound in the hall was the hum of the museum lights. One of the veterans, a man with trembling hands, stepped forward. "You remember what you told us that night in the desert, Ernst? Around the fire?" Keller smiled faintly. "Yes, I said, this isn't primitive engineering. It's practical genius." The man nodded. "You were right." Keller chuckled softly. "I was lucky. I got to see the truth early." He turned back to the Jeep, his hand still resting on it. "After the war, I worked in a motor pool. We use these very machines to rebuild our cities, to carry food, tools, bricks. Later, I trained young men to build new vehicles, not for conquest, but for life. Everything you see on the roads of Germany today. He gestured faintly toward the window where the muffled sound of traffic drifted in, was born from the lesson of this machine. He stepped back, leaning slightly on his cane. We built for perfection. They built for production, and production won the war, and rebuilt the world. The words hung in the air, not bitter, not mournful, just true. The curator's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Herr Keller," she said softly. "That was beautiful." He nodded but didn't answer. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto a bench beside the display, breathing in the quiet. Around him, the museum filled with murmurs again, visitors moving on, cameras clicking. But Keller stayed. He thought of the men who hadn't made it home. He thought of Frank, the American sergeant who'd taught him more about freedom than any ideology ever had. He thought of his students, now grown, building cars and factories that stretched across a rebuilt Germany. And he thought of the desert, endless, merciless, eternal, where the first crack in his certainty had opened, letting the truth seep in like light through armor. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully, he unfolded it. A worn metal tag, the kind riveted to an engine block. The letters were faint, but still legible. Willys Overland, Toledo, Ohio. He smiled. "Still with me," he whispered. He placed it gently on the edge of the display case beside the Jeep. A gift, a confession, a thank you. When the museum closed that evening, Keller was the last to leave. The hall lights dimmed, shadows stretching long across the floor. The Jeep sat silent, unmoving, but somehow alive. The same quiet strength it had carried through war and peace alike. As he reached the doorway, Keller looked back one last time. The glass reflected his face beside the Jeep's. Old and young, enemy and student, pride and redemption. He raised a hand in salute. Not the rigid military kind, a softer one, the kind you give to a teacher. And for a fleeting second, in the still air of that empty museum, he could almost hear it again, the steady rhythm of the Go Devil engine idling somewhere in the distance, as if the past itself was breathing. He smiled. "You were right, Frank," he murmured. "You build to save the world, not to impress it." Then he turned and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was cool, the streets alive with headlights and laughter. Cars rolled past, Volkswagens, Fords, Fiats, all descendants in one way or another of that humble machine. Keller watched them go by, his reflection flickering across their windows. He felt no regret, no bitterness, only gratitude for the strange, quiet education that had come not through victory, but through loss. He took a breath of the cool air and whispered to himself, not in German, but in English, the language of the men who had taught him how to build again. Simple is strong. And somewhere, far across the ocean, in a city called Toledo, a worker finishing his shift in a Jeep factory tightened the last bolt on a new engine. The same design, the same philosophy. Unaware that half a world away, an old German mechanic was saying goodbye to the machine that had changed him and his country forever. The Jeep stood there in the museum, timeless, not a symbol of conquest, but of education through defeat. And as the lights faded, one truth remained, carved not in metal but in memory. Perfection breaks, simplicity endures,